Hey everyone, welcome back to the Stay at Home Artist channel. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to show you how to make this cozy embroidery sweater. On the original pattern I used this sugar and cream yarn in the color Coral Seas Ombre, but today for the video I'm going to use a new color from this really fun pink yarn. You can use whatever yarn you want to, just grab a matching colored embroidery thread and you'll be good to go. And for this first part I'm going to start with using a size 5 embroidery needle with 3 strands of my pink embroidery thread. Make sure you're using 6-stranded cotton embroidery thread. I always suggest using DMC, but whatever you have available to you is great. Now that I've got my 3 strands together, I'm going to thread it onto my size 5 embroidery needle about a couple inches down, and the other end of my thread I'm going to knot. We're going to begin tracing the shape we want our sweater to be with a simple backstitch. So I'm going to start down here at the bottom of her sweater. And keep in mind to make your back stitches a little bit larger than you might normally make them. The smaller you make them, the harder it's going to be to weave your yarn in and out. Make it about the same width of the yarn that you're using. Once you finish tracing your shape with the back stitch, grab a size 2.75 hand needle from DMC, and I'm just trimming it from the skein, and then I've got one end a couple inches down from the needle, and I'm not going to knot the other end. Now I'm going to begin on the left side of her sweater and come underneath this back stitch on the bottom and leave about an inch worth of my yarn just open like that. Then grabbing my needle, I'm going to come underneath the back stitch above. I'm going to pull it under and wrap my yarn around top of the needle and pull it through that loop. And I'm going to continue doing that until I reach the top of this shape. Okay, now that my first row is created, I'm going to add a second layer by coming up through the top back stitch and coming back directly down to underneath the back stitch right next to it. And it's going to create a line which will allow me to add a new row to the previous row. So we've got this diagonal line, and now I'm going to come underneath the loops that I made in the previous step and add onto them. So I'm coming underneath both and wrapping my yarn under and over my needle. And make sure that your loose yarn doesn't get stuck in the middle of your sweater like mine did just now. So you're just going to repeat that for every little loop on your row. So under both, and then wrap your needle around and pull it through the loop. Now for this next part, I started with some new yarn, and I'm going to come down with this new piece through the top, leave the end open here, and then adding this diagonal line, and then just continuing like I did in the last step by adding on to my previous row. And if you're having any trouble with this stitch, or you feel like this is just really hard to follow, I would suggest looking at the beginner stitch video I made of this stitch. It's called the corded detached stitch. I'll link it above. I think it's super helpful if you're just starting out, because that way you can see what it looks like on a normal shape, and maybe that will help you just a little bit more. So each time I finish a row, I'm coming back down to add a new piece of yarn to add to my previous row, and it's following the same angle as all of my other previous rows. Now on this particular shape, this is where the sweater can get a little bit tricky, so I'm going to walk you through how I did it. So since the sleeve of her arm comes down to a part where we haven't added any rows with our yarn, we're going to have to make a little detour. To do is fill in some extra spaces first. So I've got a new piece of yarn, just going to bring it in on the other side of her arm and pull it through, and I'm just going to weave it through my previous rows to fill in some of the blank spaces. This is one of the cons of using a bigger kind of yarn, is that you can have more empty spaces, but I just really love the texture center of it, so it doesn't bother me to just go back and weave through some of my previous stitching. And at the top of her sleeve here, it's a little bit detached from the fabric, and I want to make sure it doesn't move away from my design. So I'm going to make a little loop with my yarn here and just pull it around so that way it's a little bit more secure. Now I'm going to bring my yarn back down to the bottom and fill in these empty spaces along the bottom side of her sweater. I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm weaving underneath her sweater. And now that I'm back over here, I'm going to continue adding to this little part on her sleeve that doesn't have a row attached to it. We're just moving back to like we did in the first step of coming underneath our back stitching and creating little loops that we're pulling through each time. Once your row is all ready to go, you can go ahead and continue just like you have with the previous parts of this pattern by adding on to each previous row with your new piece of thread. And feel free to weave in and out of any blank spots along the way. If there's anything that bothers you, like this was bothering me, I'm just gonna weave through and attach this a little bit better to the top of the fabric. And I'm grabbing another piece of yarn for the last couple rows here. And each time you grab a new piece of yarn, I suggest just leaving about an inch of it out of your sweater, and don't worry about it because we'll trim it off later, but that way you'll have enough room to work with. Okay, now that all my rows are finished, I'm just going to weave through this arm of her sweater and attach it to some of the back stitching on the top, so it's just a little bit more secure and it doesn't come up from the fabric. And now that everything's good to go, I'm just going to trim those extra pieces from the rows and the yarn that we had added before. And I'm gonna just trim it as close to the row as possible. Now I'm gonna grab my embroidery thread again, and I'm gonna grab a full 6 strands, and I'm gonna grab a size 22 chenille needle, and I'm gonna use a satin stitch to add this little part to her sleeve, and then I will go ahead and finish up the collar as well. For the collar, I'm gonna use a little bit larger of a back stitch because all I want to do is really just secure this yarn at the top and cover any of the open-ended pieces of yarn that I have hanging through, and it's just gonna tie everything together. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for joining me today. Please hit subscribe if you learned something. Have a great day.